to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Now, no one could have predicted that this unknown man, a man who lived all his life for 70 years in his native London, at the middle of the 18th century to the beginning of the 19th, a man who wrote and drew and painted the most eccentric paintings and poetry imaginable, would become one of the most celebrated writers and artists in the world. But that is William Blake for you, a free thinker who wrote what is arguably England's unofficial national anthem, the poet Jerusalem, a mystic who believed that man is the only God, and a visionary who claimed that every vision he saw and heard was actually in his mind. So it took about 100 years or so for the doors of literary perception to be cleansed, and for the canon of English poetry and world literature to see that here is a genius like no other. And so I've invited one of my favorite living writers who wrote marvelous books about all sorts of eccentrics, from Timothy Leary to the KLF, to the Beatles and James Bond, and yes, William Blake. He's John Higgs. So hi, John.
Hi, good to talk to you.
Thank you. John wrote 2 books about William Blake. William Blake Now, Why He Matters More Than Ever, published in 2019, and William Blake versus the World, published in 2021. So John, there's a podcast I love which has the same recurring question at the beginning of each episode. Were you a weird kid? So now I like to ask it a bit differently, because I know from your book, William Blake versus the World, that Blake started having vision as a very small child. But in general, do you think him the most eccentric writer there ever was? Because he does seems to be at the top.
That's a good question. A lot depends on how you define the word eccentric. If you view it in a sort of with no judgment, just in the sense of being different to the mainstream, then probably that is a fair description. He did see the world in a way that was pretty fundamentally at odds with the West of, English and Western civilization in general. So if that's not considered eccentric, I'm not quite sure what would be.
Yeah, which leads me to the next question. In your wonderful book about the KLF, you wrote about the concept of reality tunnels, a concept that the great Robert Anton Wilson invented. So now, and it's a 2-part question, could you explain the concept and maybe tell us what's one reality tunnel William Blake operated through or saw reality through?
Sure. It's probably fair to say that Robert Anton Wilson popularized that term, but he would be the first to say that he didn't invent it. He was building on Timothy Leary's ideas in particular. Yet the idea goes back thousands of years, really. It's the idea that that we don't live in the world as it is. We live in the world as we perceive it, that we've created a mental model of what the world is. And it's so convincing and so seductive that we mistake it for the real world. But a model is, by definition, a smaller, less detailed representation of what it claims to be. It's not one-to-one accurate. There's going to be places where it differs quite radically. But because we live in our reality tunnels, we don't know. We don't notice the bits where the world as we perceive it differs from the world as it is out there. And the belief that we perceive the world accurately, philosophers call it naive realism. And as I say, for centuries, since Buddha, since Plato, people have been refuting this completely. Shakespeare ridicules it, Ananias Nin, Milton. It's not a new idea. It's so convincing and so seductive and so easy to fall for our own models that we continually have to be reminded of it. And it's in William Blake. It's as a man is, so he sees. the notion that reality is almost like a Rorschach test where we see what we expect to see. That's the he talked about how, you know, a tree that can move some to tears of beauty is for other people just a green thing that stands in the way. You know, it's for Blake, the notion that there was a moral aspect to perception, that it was on us to be responsible, I guess, for the world as we perceive it runs through. This is quite a deep start to our conversation, right? But it is very sort of integral to Blake. It is kind of important to realize that everything for him was internal. You know, the world as we perceive it was internal, but also gods and angels and devils and heaven and hell and things like that. These are states of the mind, states of the imagination, and that's not what we're brought up to believe, really. The notion with, I mean, here in Britain, you get the notion that there's a place like hell, which no one really believes in anymore. You know, in this fairly secular 21st century, very few people believe deep down that there's a physical place that's situated somewhere that you could be sent to, and that's hell. Yet we've all known someone who is living in hell, and I think we all deep down recognize that to deny that would be wrong. And once you see things like hell as an internal state, it opens up the possibility that places like heaven, paradise, they're equally valid, equally real, and they are available to us. And it's not a message we really get in our culture very much. The notion that, you know, paradise is our birthright, that is where we should be. And yet all those ideas are in Blake. So yeah, I mean, it is, the idea of reality tunnels is extremely fundamental to all that.
Yeah, and I think he would put it as the importance of imagination, which is, I think, the key faculty. What I get from your work, the key faculty in Blake is the importance of imagination. You can, I mean, it's almost impossible to speak about William Blake without turning to this term. And it's, when he speaks of imagination, it's not flights of fancy. I mean, he talks about 4 types of visions. Could you maybe elaborate about that?
Sure. I mean, for Blake, the imagination is the divine aspect at play in our world. You know, there is the material, fixed, finite world, but what brings that divine spark, which brings things that are just, you know, new and unexpected, that's his vision of divinity. And for him, it is the imagination that, you know, creates things that are entirely new from nowhere. That's the sort of the crack that lets the light in, as it were, into our fixed material world. I mean, Blake would have described himself as a Christian, quite adamantly that he was a Christian, yet his definition of Christianity, you know, probably wouldn't be recognized by many other Christians that you would find these days. For him, Jesus was the imagination. And you couldn't be a Christian unless you're an artist or a painter or a musician or an architect or someone who engaged with that aspect of their mind. And it's, again, it's very, very different to the rest of the worldviews of people in London at his time, or even our time, or something like that. It's so different that very few people, if any, could understand him at the time. We're fortunate now. We've had a couple of 100 years of, real thorough scholarly analysis, trying to understand this mythology he created for all his work, which he kind of like didn't bother explaining. He just sort of assumed people would know almost who all these characters sort of represented. So his work's been really sort of studied. We've got a much better understanding of it now than we did. But at the time, he was just you know, I mean, he had one exhibition in his entire lifetime, and it wasn't in a proper gallery. It was in it was his brother's shop, and it got one review, and they called him an unfortunate lunatic, and nothing was sold. So that's kind of how he was sort of perceived at the time, with this very, very different understanding of the world. And how different we see him now. Now we sort of recognize that no, his stuff isn't just, you know, the ravings of a madman. There was a very comprehensible system there. We don't quite have our heads around all of it, but we sort of know enough to see how interesting it is and how well it all sort of fits together. And vision is integral to it. You know, it's something. I mean, he had visions all his life, from being a very young child all the way to old age, and they were everything to him. They were what the joy of being alive was. The sort of that moments when he's sort of overwhelmed by his imagination, and he sees all the sight. I mean, if you're familiar with his artwork, you'll get a sense of what he says, because he always says everything he painted was something he saw in his mind first, in his mind's eye, he saw in vision everything that he painted. And you look at those artworks and you just believe him. There is some quality about them that you just go, these come from elsewhere. These, you know, these are very haunting, powerful, extraordinary things. I think his artwork, you know, is probably the greatest proof of the evidence of a divine aspect to the universe that we have. You know, the imagination is divinity for Blake. And yes, there was different levels of imagination, and you know, and he was always aware that what he saw was not what other people saw. It's like he wasn't mad, right? He didn't believe that the visions that he got he didn't believe that they were, you know, true, and other people could see them and things like that. He always knew it was a combination of his mind and his imagination and the world he was perceiving, which is lucky, really, because someone with an imagination that was that overwhelming and that powerful could quite easily have fallen for it. You know, they could quite easily have believed that what they were perceiving was true, but Blake never really did, and he always knew it was the imagination, and he always saw the imagination as a muscle that we all had, and something that we could all strengthen and we could all exercise and all improve, and that was something that we should do, because that was the way to a life worth living, I guess.
Yeah, and you've mentioned the mythology he created, which we don't really understand fully, and sometimes it seems that which is okay, that he contradicts himself in different aspects, or always developing it, and it's never at a standstill. I mean,
it's surprisingly consistent, considering how long he worked with these characters and these ideas. It was a mythology based around four main characters called the four Zoas, who were, I think, the easiest way to start thinking about them is to view them as aspects of our minds. You know, Blake was writing 100 years before Freud or Jung or that whole field of you know, psychiatry or psychoanalysis, or the sort of the study of the mind. So he didn't have those sort of tools. He just personified these different aspects of ourselves, and he was interested in how they clashed, how the issues between them, when he put them together, what would be how they'd see things differently, what the sort of fight would be. So on some levels, it's tempting to say that his mythology is, you know, pre-psychoanalysis study of who we are and of the mind, and it is quite helpful to think of things that way, like the character of Urizen, who's a very important part of his aspect, who is the stern lawgiver, father figure, his rationality. He's the one truth. He's very much our left brain. That's that aspect of us. But the other Zoas represent, emotion, creativity, physical sensation, all of these other aspects of us, and we need them all in balance, as Blake saw it. We need as he saw it, the rational side of humanity had taken over, and that's what put us all out of balance. And we needed the creativity and the imagination and the emotional side of ourselves to sort of rise sufficiently to balance this overbearing sort of law-giving left brain sort of side of us. So this is quite fascinating for a mythological system to work on all these sort of levels. They're all kind of fun. You've got these giant superhuman sort of figures in constant battle and that's which is really sort of enjoyable on its own sort of level. But when you see it as actually those are all, well, what's going on in the world, but they're also what's going on in me. They all work on all these different levels. They do get fascinating, and Blake was very astute about people. He was very understanding of humanity. He lived at a very revolutionary time, particularly in the 1790s, where he did so much of his most important work, where the French Revolution was ongoing and all these sort of things. And whereas a lot of romantic poets, it was very easy just to idealize the revolution. You got lines like, "Oh, what it was to be young. To be young was very heaven." I'm quoting that horribly badly, but the Wordsworth sort of quote of just the revolution was this simple joy. But I think Blake understood how humans worked on a much more nuanced level. So when the French Revolution did lead into, rivers of blood running through Paris and this power vacuum and the rise of the dictator figure in Napoleon and all these sort of things, a lot of people who supported the revolution were just like horrified, and they couldn't understand why this most rational of progressive movements had gone so horribly wrong. But Blake knew that it was going to. He knew things weren't so simple as that. And you find all these insights into our history and ourselves playing out in these myths that he wrote. So they're endlessly fascinating, and I can't recommend enough that people start to explore the world of Blake, because it's so deep and worthwhile and useful, I think.
There's the psychological aspect that you've pointed out, and everyone who read or saw paintings of Jung's Red Book would obviously think of Jung as a follower of William Blake, which he knew. And but I'm also thinking about Tolkien as like Tolkien always wanted to write a mythology of England. And here is a writer who lived more than 100 years before him, who did exactly that, in a sense, write a mythology for his land.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely he did. He's Albion, England, all of Britain really, is as much a character in a lot of his work as these figures that I'm talking about. Albion is represented by this giant figure, the giant Albion, and it's not, in a way, how can I put this? It's just because that's where he was. That was the world around him that he was illuminating with his imagination. A lot of his epic poem Jerusalem is about London being turned into the holy city of Jerusalem through the imagination. When he's talking about the pavements of St. Pancras being golden or something like that, he's not expecting people to come along and dig up the pavement and put gold down there instead. It's not a physical version of London that is this spiritual city that he's talking about. It's that combination of that internal light within us expanded on that. So even though he does talk a lot about Britain, what he's saying is universal. I think it's wherever you are, what he's saying is equally true. And it's fascinating that you compare him to Tolkien, because yes, I think they both. I think in Britain we've had our past sort of cut off quite a bit with this is going back to 1066, the Norman invasion, and there's an aristocratic class who sort of own the country, and all our myths and our culture, and there's a lot of deep Welsh myths and a lot of really wonderful sort of stories that have been sort of wiped away, and we sort of not, we're not sort of told them. So it was important to Tolkien to sort of go back and try and create what we'd been lost on some levels. And it's slightly frustrating that his estate is so strict on copyright. You can't copyright a myth. A myth just has to run wild and and do what it wants to do. You can't have people saying, well, you're not allowed to use the word hobbit, and things like that, as the Tolkien estate are very, very strict on. So it's this weird thing where he was trying to create this myth, but legal have descended, which most myths have never had to deal with legals. The Norse myths or something like the Greek myths never had that sort of stuff to deal with. But yeah, there's definite similarities between Blake and Tolkien, I'd say.
Something that always interests me about Blake is his understanding of Isaac Newton. I work in the National Library of Israel, and we have, I think, hundreds of Newton's writing, his theological writings. And Blake seems to think that Newton doesn't have an imagination. He's sort of a human Urizen, which always calculates. He is in the bottom of the sea, but he can't see the rifts there, and all this beauty. He only calculates. I mean, Blake didn't know about that part of Newton and only saw him as a man of science and rationality.
Yes, I think that's true. I don't think he understood the alchemical side of Newton, or even the religious or spiritual side of him that we now know from all his diaries and things like that. So he becomes a bit of a figure that Blake uses to kick about, a bit of a straw man. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep is something he writes about. He sees it's really scientific, detached observation of the material world that he's railing against. He's using Newton as an example. The belief that you can objectively observe the world with no subjective aspect of yourself, sort of part of that. Now I think we agree with him. Now we realize the extent to which our subjective self influences our perceptions and things like that. But for Blake, I mean, there's that wonderful painting that I think you were referring to, which it seems to show it shows Newton. He seems to be under the sea. He seems to be sitting on this strange sort of coral sort of thing, but he's leaning down. He's focused on a scroll or a papyrus, and he's got a golden compass, and he's marking out a circle. And he's so focused on this, he's not paying any attention to the strange underwater world behind him. But it's not really underwater, because he's not wet and the pavement's not wet. It's the sort of the unformed organic sort of cosmos in its true self, and he can't see it. All he can see is his rational sort of dividing line, what the compass is doing, the finite little world that he's sort of producing from reason and from mathematics is so tiny compared to the enormity of our cosmos. But at the same time, Blake isn't kicking Newton. He knows he's important, and he portrays him as this sort of idealized sort of like a Greek hero. So he's sort of blonde and muscular, and he's he's not just mind, you know, he is a hero of history. He's a very important person. He's changing our world, is what Newton did, and he knows that, and he knows that's important. But it was at that time, really the Age of Enlightenment. It was kind of, I don't know, to try and boil it down, it was a time when people were moving from a world where the most important thing was faith. Faith was our primary way of understanding the world, and moving to a world where reason became our primary way of understanding it. And for Blake, it was like, well, I'm all right, I'm with you with the faith thing. I'm moving away from faith. That's okay with me. But reason is only a really small part of what our minds are and what our minds do. You're missing out so much, and you're missing out the imagination, which, as we said, is so important to Blake. So the rise of this sort of way of perceiving the material world that denied, you know, so much of consciousness, Blake was horrified by, and he was always attacking on it. And poor Newton became the sort of the figurehead of it, really, in many ways. I think if Blake had read Newton's notebooks about all his alchemical interests and things like that, I think he would have been amazed.
Yeah, and maps which details from exactly where the apocalypse is going to happen, and not very reasonable, to say the least. I mean, there's a saying in Hebrew that you don't give the praise to the man in front of him, but I do want to give you praises for your second book about Blake, because to me the book is doing exactly that: the marriage of heaven and hell, or the marriage of imagination, science, and reason and creativity. Because when I was a student at the university, I went to see a guest lecture, and the lecturer talked about the need to incorporate the amazing discoveries in the field of neurology and brain studies with the humanities. I studied humanities. Mm-hmm. And I remember everyone in the lecture hall was dismissive, which struck me at the time as a missed opportunity. Mm. And years later, I read your book, William Blake versus the World, to find you did just that. I mean, how did you come to the idea to use scientific research, mainly about the brain, but not?
It was basically, I think with a lot of people, for many years, I'd been attracted to Blake. And I think it's so common. You just see an image, or you hear a few lines of poetry, and you know that that's important, and you know you're drawn to it on some level. But there didn't seem to be a way in. It was almost as if like Blake was this like extraordinary Gothic castle that you come to, and you know that inside there's wonders and there's treasures, but there doesn't seem to be a way. You're not sure if you're allowed in. You know, there was maybe there's gatekeepers trying to keep you out, or there's a lot of very academic writing about him, which is very valuable and very important, but it's not really a way in. It's not welcoming. And there was something about Blake that was strangely disturbing and off-putting, but at the same time, I knew that he as a person wasn't like that, and I knew that he as a person wanted to sort of attract people and communicate with people and things like that. So it was really writing the book I thought needed to exist, and I wanted to read, which was using what we know now in the early 21st century to look at Blake and see, you know, what we make of it, put a frame around it, try and grasp what he was telling us. And there is this lovely aspect of Blake in that as we get further and further away from his lifetime, and we learn more and more about the nature of reality and more about how things work and stuff like that, we just constantly sort of find ourselves going, oh yeah, Blake knew that, you know, oh Blake was right about that. You know, it's as we get further away from him, the more it's like almost catching up with him. It was like he was so far ahead of the world. We're sort of getting there with it. And I use a lot. Talking about something like quantum mechanics and stuff like that. I'm not saying that Blake understood quantum mechanics, but I'm saying that the metaphors that we've created to understand a lot of quantum mechanics fit very, very well with what he was saying, with his understanding of the world. It does fit. It does sort of match on a number of levels. And when something does work, psychologically, scientifically, artistically, politically, on all these levels, in terms of sexuality and radicalism and all these sort of things, when these do all fit together, it is kind of an indication that there's a really interesting mind at work here. And if, the more we can learn from him, the better we will be. Yeah, it would seem to be doing him a misservice not to look at him from all those perspectives, I think, because he certainly holds up to it.
Yeah, and to bring back science, I mean, he wasn't, as I understand it, maybe I'm wrong, but he wasn't totally opposed to science or reason, but he thought that you need, obviously, to enhance it with imagination. And you have a point in the book that you say something that is very interesting to think about art itself. I mean, that William Blake is perhaps the best example of a visionary that made us see his visions through his art.
Yeah, I think so. In the end of a lengthy piece of prose called The Four Zoas, it comes to the conclusion. I think the last line is, when all those mythological characters, after all their battles and things, everything falls into harmony. And the last line is something like, and sweet science will reign. And it's a surprise to a lot of people who looked at Blake's work, particularly in the 60s, and saw in it, I mean, in the 60s, there was so much of Blake that was spot on for the zeitgeist. There was all the sexual side of it, the anti-establishment side of it, the radical side of it. This was just fantastic. It was very, very psychedelic as well. So it fitted the 60s counterculture perfectly. But it could often be perceived as a battle between a figure called Loss, who represents creativity, the burning imagination. He's sometimes depicted with his head on fire, because that's what it's like to sort of be wrestling with creativity. And this character Urizen, who I mentioned earlier, who is rational, and it was seen as a battle that really Blake wanted Loss to beat Urizen. That's sort of how it's perceived and presented as a lot of time. When you get into it, it isn't that in the end. It's all those characters are needed and they're all necessary, and Urizen is needed and necessary, but it just needs to be in balance. It needs everything. It needs every aspect to create the golden world that we should be living in. So it is it's, as I say, it's not a case of like just a battle with a good guy who's going to win. It's like if we get everything right, then that's how science should be. That sweet science should work. That was natural science he was sort of talking about at the time. But that perception and understanding of the world will be cleansed. So I'm babbling slightly here. You must apologize.
No, it's the marriage of heaven and hell in a sense.
Yeah. Which has got really, theologically radical title, isn't it? I mean, it's for Blake, you can't just look at heaven and you just can't, or hell as a separate thing. They sort of, he dealt so much in opposites or contraries, which sort of created each other, and they were meaningless without each other. And it was really the dynamic energy between these opposing poles that was what our world is. It was the opposites that sort of create our world. And he was very, very much in favor of that sort of, opposition is true friendship, he would say, and things like that, which is quite a radical sort of comment as well. So yeah, the marriage of heaven and hell, to sort of join these things, is unlike anyone other writer that I can think of, but really an interesting perspective to explore.
Yeah, I'm thinking about catching up to Blake in so many fields. First of all, Freud talked about that, about the fact that actually poets invented subconscious. I mean, they discovered it beforehand. And the marriage of heaven and hell, you can think about the novel Good Omens as the devil and the angel trying to, I don't know, to keep the world, because both of them doesn't want the apocalypse or the heaven.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the way we sort of perceive the world. If you go back to when we're just born and you're just a baby and you've got no mental model of what the external world is in your head, you've got your senses and they're sending you information about the world, but you don't know what any of it is. You don't know at all. And the first thing babies work out is dark and light, like black and white. They're really interested in checkerboard patterns. They don't understand color at this point. Obviously their eyes are working properly, but they haven't sort of conceptualized the concept of color. So the first thing they get is night and day, dark and light, and then it's things like hot and cold, and like hungry and not hungry, and they slowly build the world, their mental model of the world, through opposites, through these sort of different contrasting things. That's how they become aware of something. They become aware of it as different to another sort of thing. And so that is that use of contraries, as Blake would call it, of opposites, is what builds our world. So it's like, as many things in life and our societies improve in terms of our health and our access to food and things like this, we still complain the same level. We always have, we always see things as good and bad, and that sort of contrast is always there. It doesn't matter how much things improve or get worse or whatever. We sort of still have that sort of fixed sort of little battle sort of going on, and we always will. It's absolutely sort of fundamental to the way sort of Blake saw the world, and he thought you need it, and to deny part of it. It's why the marriage of heaven and hell, which is a extraordinary radical but funny document that he wrote in the early 1790s, is such a great introduction to Blake for so many people. It's got this wonderful section called the Proverbs of Hell, where he's trying to stress the importance of diabolical sort of wisdom, because all the other books only care about heavenly wisdom. So he's got all these great little pithy one-liners that are the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, and all these little great little lines like that. Yeah, sorry, I'm just babbling again. So I'm afraid Blake can do that to me sometimes. You just set me off. I do apologize if I'm failing to answer questions.
There's a sense, speaking about opposites, there's a sense in Blake that what happens in the soul and what happens in the social sphere, these are two sides of the same coin. I mean, you get it. You find a lot of social commentary in, say, Sounds of Innocence and Experience. I mean, that all forms of repression seems to be the same. And he actually hates the Christian virtue of pity. I mean, pity is for the powerful, a way to keep the lower classes down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's for such a committed Christian, he's very against the church. Yeah, he didn't like go to church and things like that. And he would write, priests in black gowns were doing their rounds and binding it with briars my joys and desires. He saw them as crushing these utterly necessary aspects of the human spirit: pleasure, joy, things like this. He really hated the church for controlling how we expressed our inner emotions and things like that. So yeah, he's it's very easy to paint him as anti God. You know, he has this great, and it sounds a very modern word as well. The word for God he calls Nobo Daddy. It sounds like something that's made up fairly recently, a mixture of nobody and the daddy sort of aspect of the great Nobo Daddy in the sky. But that's very much the God as the church presents it. This stern sky ruler, you know, with laying down the laws, which for him is far removed from that genuine fire of the imagination, which is the divine aspect of the universe as he sees it. So he can seem to be very against that. I mean, for him, the Old Testament in particular was divinely inspired because it was so visionary. As a piece of writing, he could only see it as divine. It was so imaginative. It was so wild. It was so powerful, you know. And compared to that, things like Greek philosophy, you know, Greek and Roman ideas were just nothing. They were just devoid of that imaginative spark that he found in the Old Testament. And so a lot of it is sort of raging against the university system here in the UK, which was, you know, Oxford and Cambridge were the great universities at the time, who sort of were raised on, they were Christian, but they were very steeped in, you know, Greek thought and things like that. And this was all dead to him. You know, it didn't have the flaming truth of the Hebrew Bibles as far as he saw it. You know, those were self-evidently pure imagination and therefore divine to him.
Which is interesting because the God of the Old Testament is in a sense Nobo Daddy.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Nobo Daddy.
It is. He is an aspect of us, and it's not. And yeah, it is a fascinating sort of clash. That there's that period where there was the rise of the patriarchal sky gods in our mental development. Whether we're talking Zeus or we're talking Odin, you know, or we're talking about the Christian Judaic sort of God, which is patriarchal and male and laying down the law. That for him is not God. That isn't God. Despite everything I was saying about how he sees the Old Testament as self-evidently divinely inspired, the descriptions of God is just an aspect of us. But everything is for Blake. So it's not that odd. You know, all heaven and hell, demons, God, they're all part of us. But that doesn't mean they're not divine, but they're just part of us. So yeah, it's a different way of thinking about things, and it can take a little bit for it to click into place, and then you go, oh yeah, I get that, I get it now. But it does all make sense, and it's wonderfully contradictory when you come to it from a standard Western worldview.
Yeah.
So it's so great at sort of making you realize how you've been trained to think and how sort of limited that is, you know.
And how revolutionary his mind was.
Yeah.
I mean, he tells a friend, Jesus is the only God, and so am I, and so are you.
I know, and it's such a wonderful thing to say, that I start the book with it, because it's at the time, it's just like the guy, Henry Crabb Robertson, he was talking to, he wrote it in his diary, so we know about it, but he just had no clue what he was talking about. You know, it was, it didn't make sense. You know, Jesus is the only God, and so am I, and so are you. It's just so strange and contradictory. But when we see Jesus as the divine aspect of the imagination, that's the only God, and I have it, and you have it as well. And it's the fact that you have it. It wasn't a case of, and I have it, but you don't. I'm the true visionary, imaginary sort of artist here. You know, I'm the special one. Blake didn't have that. He didn't want to be put on a pedestal. You know, he saw all of humanity as having the potential to reach those sort of imaginary sort of levels that he got to, and he wanted everyone else to join him. You know, he didn't want to be the great, you know, visionary prophet that everybody just follows and admires. He wanted everyone to be like him, you know, so he wouldn't be so alone, I guess. And so to that, and so that statement, and so am I, and so are you, tells you so much about how he saw the world once once it's clicked into place and once you've deciphered it, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Jung's idea of the image of the Godhead inside each person that I don't know, makes him basically, I don't know, sends him on his destiny, on his way. And what do you think about the term subconscious? I mean, if Blake knew it, would he found that a helpful concept, or is it not divine enough?
It's the mind, so it is divine enough. But whether, because the subconscious is something we're not aware of. It's what's going on underneath, and it might pop out in dreams and things like that. It's awareness is such an intrinsic part of the imagination that I think he would be less interested for those. It's what appears in the mind that was what matters to Blake. You know, I mean, subconscious is a good way for people studying the mind to sort of try and understand what appears by sort of looking for deeper and deeper levels. But I think Blake would probably be more interested in the conscious than the unconscious, or the subconscious, sorry. I would say anyway.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Borges said, that subconscious is just the mythology of our age, and we should just, he has
that great phrase, the mind forged manacles, to sort of represent what binds us, but it's not. It's just the mind. It's just the way we've been trained to perceive. That's our mind forged manacles. That's what's holding us down.
Yeah.
It's breaking out of that. That is what he's always clamoring for, always calling for, just to escape from those mind forged manacles, and, you know, understand the world as it is, not as society tells you it is.
Now, for obvious reasons, most editions of Blake's poetry don't include his paintings, which he combines with his words. I mean, he created both of them simultaneously. What do you think of that lost for the readers?
Oh, it's a really good question. I mean, Blake is pretty unique, I think, in being as well regarded as a genius for painting and for poetry. I can't think of anyone else who, I mean, a lot of people, you know, do both things, but they might be seen as a genius in one way. But it's like, you know, Paul McCartney is a genius musician and he paints. You know, no one's going to hold up his painting as important as, you know, writing Yesterday or anything like that. So very, very rare to get someone who is as equally well regarded. And there was here in the UK at the Tate Gallery, they had in 2020, I think it was, end of 2019, they had this huge retrospective of his paintings without any regard to, you know, his poetry, to sort of show his importance as a visual artist. And it worked great. You know, it was overwhelming, really. There was so much work. It was so extraordinary and so powerful. But you didn't come away going, well, I only got half the picture. You know, he expresses himself so perfectly in all these different ways. It's a great shame we don't have any of his music. You know, a lot of his poems are songs, and he had music for them, but that's all been lost now, sadly. It's almost like the creative urge comes first, and then it's channeled. You know, down a particular medium. And that's very, very rare. That's very, very rare, because it's normally an artist would have their medium, and it's through engaging with that that they're able to express that sort of deeper part of themselves. But for someone to be able to do that in completely different mediums, there's no one else like him.
Yeah, and he started it since he was a boy. I mean, he started painting and writing poems or songs, or yeah.
Yeah, he's a real worker. He's a real grafter. He's very urban, working class. The Romantics who came just a little after him, you imagine to be aristocrats sort of leaning on chaise longues with writing their waiting for the muses to give them, probably quite high on opium, just gentle flowing work. For Blake, it was printing technology, it was acids, and it was metal, and it was hard labor, and it was creating art was physical on some level, and it was so, yes, very, very different to the Romantics that sort of came. And I think that's another aspect of him that's aged really well, this sort of working, hard working, laboring, working class son of London. I think he's easy to identify with for a lot of people, in a way that the more rarefied aristocrats who wrote a little poem here and there aren't.
Yeah. You don't write as much, and you don't really tame the imagination, which is something you need to tame in order to write.
Yeah.
I mean, so you wrote 2 books about William Blake.
Yeah, I mean, the first one was just a little essay. It was a small introductory sort of thing, and it was about how he fits into the modern world. This 18th century visionary mystic may not seem an immediate relevant voice, but that was just to say, no, he is. Whereas the book you were talking about earlier, William Blake versus the World, that's the one. Basically, that's my attempt to sort of introduce him to people and give people a way to grasp what he was talking about.
But which world are you referring to? His world, our world? Who is against him, or who is he against?
Well, I mean, the title, William Blake versus the World, it's very easy to see him as a tragic figure, because I mentioned earlier how his one review wrote him off as an unfortunate lunatic, and when he died, he was buried in a pauper's grave on what was then the outskirts of London, and it looked for all the world like he would be forgotten, and that there wasn't an audience for what he produced. And although friends were very fond of him, the world saw him as this mad, crazy person, and the idea then that we'd still be talking about him 200 years later, and whereas the great artists of the time we've completely forgotten, that would have amazed people. It's very easy to see the Blake story in the sense that he was defeated by the world because of his lack of success and his failure to sell his work and things like that. But Blake, it was different territory for him. As he saw it, his life was incredible success. He had he could spend so much of his life engaging in the visionary world that he wouldn't have swapped it for anything. He had he was rich on every level that matters, with the obvious exception of financially. His life was great. His life was meaningful. His life was a pleasure and a joy, particularly towards the end. There's certain, in his middle ages, you can see he's a bit more frustrated and his mental health isn't so good, and he's getting into arguments with people. But by the descriptions of him in his later years, he's a man at peace with himself. So the material world when we look at it, we see that, he was defeated by the material world. But he wasn't working on that level. He was working on an immaterial level. And in that level, his life was such a success, was such a great success. And I think that's what I was getting with that title, William Blake versus the World. hopefully if you get the reader to sort of make that mental shift as they go along, then that's great. You've won. you've got Blake across perfectly.
Yeah, which seems the mark of a true artist. I mean, to be satisfied with the work, which is so engaging. And I mean, it's so appropriate that I'm sitting here in Jerusalem and you're in the UK, and we're talking about William Blake. So first of all, thank you for this wonderful talk. And
it's been lovely talking to you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. I end each episode with a few recommendations. So it's again a twofold question. So where should we start, or where should one start with Blake? And what other writers you feel are disciples of him? Because I think about Alan Moore, which you wrote about, the great writer of comics, for example, but we can find others, of course.
I probably would have gone with Alan Moore, to be honest. That was the first voice that sort of came to mind, particularly because that mix of images and text, which marks the comic.
And so many Blake references.
I would, in that case, we're not. If you've got Alan, I would say David Keenan. Do you know the Scottish writer David Keenan?
No.
He's a superb, and he is working on a very sort of Blakean level, in that it just pours through him. The imagination just pours through him. He's probably best known for a book called This Is Memorial Device, which is about an imaginary Scottish independent music scene in the 1980s. It's such a good read. This Is Memorial Device. But he's also written this absolutely epic, fat novel called Monument Maker, which is about it's about everything really, but a lot of cathedrals in it. I can't even begin to sort of explain it. But David Keenan is well worth looking out for as a child of Blake, I would say.
Yeah. And where should we start with Blake? I mean, you said Marriage of Heaven and Hell.
I try and point people towards Marriage of Heaven and Hell. People are taught Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience at school, which is great, and a fine way to, and they're sort of short and they make sense, but they're not steeped in his mythology, so they you don't need to know anything about it. But it's like, I mean, Songs of Innocence in particular, they're children's songs, and it's kind of like if you wanted to get someone into the Beatles and you play them Yellow Submarine, it's fine, but there's a whole lot more that's not sort of so I think the Marriage of Heaven and Hell is, because it's not that long, and it's funny, and it's outrageous, and it's you read that and then you'll probably be hooked on Blake, I think.
Awesome. So thank you again for this wonderful, very interesting talk. And if I can recommend one book about Blake, it would be William Blake versus the World.
Oh, obviously. Bless you. That's very kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, Dan.